that, I hope.
Yes.
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 First of all, I'd say the Caddo have a tradition of building mounds that goes back to approximately AD 900 and ended about 1691. And the Spanish explorers actually made a map showing that the last constructed mound. But that's 800 years of mounds being built in this area for a variety of purposes and in a variety of places. What I'm going to be concerned with is the period of time from 1150 years ago to approximately 260 years ago, and going to be dealing with just with East Texas, but East Texas is part of a larger area that we call the southern area, but that may have to be changed based on some findings that are coming from what is known as the northern Caddo area in the Arkansas River Basin off this map. The Caddo were farmers. They liked the forest, they liked the piney woods and the savanna, and occasionally will even settle in the Blackland Prairie along the corridor of the South Sulphur River. To say it's a boundary is, it's convenient for archaeological purposes, but it's really pretty vague. We don't know much about investigations in this southern area, certainly, or up in here, though there has been some recent work. I think it's still ongoing at Lower Bodark Reservoir, and understand there's lots of really good sites being investigated there. Okay. There are 115 known Caddo mounds in East Texas, and these have been compiled probably over a good 150 years of pot hunting, avocational work, professionals, construction, whatever. The earliest evidence that I've come across of a Caddo mound being mentioned is in the Slave Chronicles from 1865. And this particular slave describes he and several fellows being sent out on the Sabine River to dig this big sandy mound, which they proceeded to do. And when they got down to about 15 feet, they found several sets of teeth. And at that point, they jumped out of the mound and ran away. As to exactly what site that is, not really sure, other than it's on the north side of the Sabine River. Gary, you might know of that. Where's Gary Pinkerton? Because it's mentioned close to a river ferry crossing on the Sabine. Anyway, you can see that there's various clusters, but more or less, at first blush, a random but semi-continuous series of mounds throughout the East Texas area, and with clusters of different times and places. This will give you a little better idea. We're broken it up into sites that just have a single mound versus those that have multiple mounds. And I think it's pretty clear here that the multiple mound sites, the biggest, the most complex, are concentrated on the Red River and the Sabine River, with much less mound building activity along Cypress Bay or the Neches River. And to me, this says there were at least two different ways that the Caddo organized themselves socially and politically and religiously. And the mound sites reflect this. And when we get into the time period, we can see that even more. I should say, if anybody has a question while I'm rambling on, feel free to bump in if that's okay, Nick.
Certainly, yes.
Okay. This is the 1691 map that the Tehran expedition made in 1691 when they were on the Red River and they were looking for the French. And this is from a known site. We don't have a scale, but we believe this could easily be 6 or 7 miles long of these farm compounds with grass thatched houses and ramadas and granaries. But the most interesting part of it is at the western end is a earthen mound, which had, according to the Spanish, a templo on it. We know where that mound is, and we'll be talking about it later. Another site that we know has mounds, but they don't show on here, is in the middle where you can see this cross on the map, and that's where a French trader had been murdered at this village, and that's where he was buried. And he was buried. This is the compound of the caddy, the village chief. This was his house, but we know where this place is. There's another mound site that's probably here, and then they continue into Arkansas. But this is a beautiful map for the time to get a sense of what a Caddo village and compound look like. We do know archeologically, even though this is shown at the edge of the village continued on for several miles west as well, but those areas may have been abandoned by 1691. We don't really know. Okay, what I've tried to do here is, as I said, there's 115 earthen mounds that have been identified as Caddo, but very few have been investigated in any way, shape, or form where we know when they were occupied or much about the character of the sites. So I've tried to restrict myself to those where there has been archaeological investigations going back to 1931, or sites that mostly have radiocarbon dates of one kind or another. And we have some kind of a plan of the mounds, and maybe if they had a plaza or something. So start with number 1, which is George C. Davis site, which I'm sure most people are aware of. And this is called Caddo Mound State Historic Site now. It's on the Neches River down here along a Caddo trail crossing, now known as El Camino de los Tejas. But it had 3 mounds. I can barely see those there, but the 2 big platform mounds, and by that I mean they were built to make a platform for the Caddo to build special structures on, either specialized structures or the houses of the political and social elite. There's still one borrow pit visible that where they got the dirt to build the mound and to get different colors of clay. And then at the top have Mound C, which is a conical burial mound. And I think it's estimated only a little bit of it has been excavated, but it seems to be there could be 70 or 80 deep shaft tombs in there for probably the people who were living here and running this community. We don't know much about the community per se, but it certainly extends at least 20 miles north up to the Neches River and goes off into the Angelina River. This is one of the first sites ever excavated and published by a Caddo archaeologist, when Alex Krieger and Perry Newell wrote their report, which was published by the Society for American Archaeology in 1941. And it's a classic landmark study because of the extent of excavations they were able to do, and houses that were exposed on the mounds or between the mounds, and the very distinctive ceramics that show up there. It's also, thanks to work done by Deanne Story, it's pretty well dated. Basically, even you can see these different groups are organized by the mound that they're coming from. So here's the burial mound, and then here's one of the platform mounds, and you can see it's younger than the burial mound, but more contemporaneous with the other platform mound. And based on various statistical procedures that Zach Selden could explain, we've recognized two main radiocarbon groups at this site. One that dates from AD 896 through 1012, and there's like 47 dates. And then the larger group dates from AD 1185 to 1258. And so it started in what we called formative Caddo, probably with the construction of the first platform mound and the shaft tombs, because under the mound that has all the burials is a sub mound shaft tomb that has a berm around it. And those are probably the first sign of the political activity that's taking place in the Caddo area, is at this place. Here, an example of how important it was to be have your house situated near one of the platform mounds. Here's the edge of the platform mound here, and it goes off to your left. But just look at the number of houses that have been constructed here in overlapping structures, plus, and some of these are extremely large. Also distinctive kinds of structures, mainly circular, but you have here a double walled, kind of a rectangular structure. Here's one where it looks like they excavated the posts in a trench, all kinds of different things. And then this structure here, I don't even know what you call it. Let's see. This is what it looked like in the field. I think they called this the maze, but they had the trenches formed the walls, and you can see at least three, four series of walls. An entrance here, the central hearth here. This was a very important structure, but it was not on a mound. Second platform had
Tim.
Yeah,
This is. I somehow clicked something, and all I see is you, exceptionally handsome gentleman, and don't see your presentation. What did I do?
I don't know. Can anybody else see the presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I do.
Well, shucks.
Once you go back out, come back into Zoom, and because there's nothing I can do to help you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, Phil?
Okay, I got it. I got it.
You got
I
it?
wanted you
Did
to
you find
reach in and slap me upside the head, but
You need a visual slap icon.
yeah. Okay, I got it now. Go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's all right. This is the second platform mound at George C. Davis, and it had at least 4 structures standing on it, including a rather large one here. These were partially exposed in excavations done in 1969 and 1970 by Deanne Story and UT. These were important structures of one kind or another. It's just too bad that these structures have not been completely exposed, so we could see what they look like, because I'm sure there were interesting things going on there. All right, this is a profile view of Mound C, which is the burial mound, and you can see in this profile here the different shaft tombs that are coming down. They're all of different colors. Underneath it was a berm, here. That was this kind of sub-mound tomb. But I don't know, maybe they might have excavated 20% of this thing. So that's how they estimated there may be 75 in here. And most of them, if not all of them, are spectacular in terms of they have multiple individuals interred in them, along with a wide variety of grave goods, most of which came from outside of Texas, as far away as Cahokia, perhaps. The grave goods were put in the shaft tomb, but not necessarily in association with any particular individual. But what you might have is, some of these had as many as, I think, 9 or 11 individuals. And you would have a central individual, an adult male with an adult female laying next to them or partially on top of them. And then a series of young adult males that have that you could suggest are retainer sacrifices. They occur on either side of this principal individual. Okay. One thing that's been done more recently is remote sensing of a large portion of the park, looking for other evidence of structures. And this shows at least 79 or 80 have been identified in the remote sensing. Again, overlapping, but including things down here on the left that are called button houses because they have 2 prominent sort of support posts, or 4 anyway, but they occur all in this one area. None of these have been excavated, but it would be nice to have a modern excavation because things are so different now in terms of the kinds of samples we collect for dating, for plant remains, for every kind of analysis that were not available when this work was done. And so even if you just could pick one of these and excavate it thoroughly, I feel pretty sure that it would be a tremendous advance in knowledge of Caddo archaeology for this period anyway. At the top here, you can see that's part of the Camino Real, all this old trail ruts. And the site, as we know it, continues well north. There are 5 or 6 different sites with different trinomials, but they're all related to George C. Davis in one way or another. And again, this is an example of, I would say, the largest early Caddo multiple mound center, where you can see there's 8 different mounds arranged around a large plaza and borrow pit areas. The site is the Hudnall-Perttula site. It's situated on the Sabine River at a low water crossing, very poorly known. The THC did limited testing down here on part of the, and then in this mound, and we did not have permission to do any others. Pot hunters got in here and found a community cemetery with over 100 burials in it up here, and proceeded to loot those. And the only thing we have on that are some pictures. But this was probably the premier early Caddo mound center in East Texas at that time. And that would be, I have a couple of radiocarbon dates that range from 1014 to 1235 AD. The one mound that we were able to excavate is a house mound or substructural. Excuse me, I heard somebody say something.
No.
Okay. The profile shows here at the bottom.
What do you there? Why don't you take it for tomorrow? Okay.
Okay, somebody needs to mute their microphone. Under the mound, there was a structure which was eventually abandoned and burned down, and then subsequently covered with the first mound fill. And then here came another area of mound debris from a burned house, and then a mound fill up above it. None of the other mounds have received any professional investigations. I understand that, let me see, go back here. I believe it's this one is composed of about 15 feet of sand, and a well-known collector decided that he would dig this by himself. And he did until he buried himself up to his neck in it. This turned out to be a fellow named Buddy Calvin Jones. And several people have attempted to try to get into this one. And I think this is the mound that the slave chronicles were talking about in 1865 as having, you know, really thick, deep sand with sets of teeth at 15 feet.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. Okay. Box Springs is another multiple mound center with a plaza. Here where the metal building is, they built it over a Caddo cemetery, in part to protect it, but it had been looted to some extent beforehand. But you can see the circular arrangement with a plaza in between. This has more habitation material around it. This kind of shows one area that we were able to shovel test with the permission of the landowner. And most of that is running from up here along the western edge. So we were not able to get in here. And then the landowner sold part of the property. And one of these mounds has been recently shovel tested by Crystal Dozier at Wichita State University. She had a mini field school there during the COVID, but didn't really learn anything other than that it had pottery. Under Mound A, which you can see here at the top of the central area, had a big rectangular tomb in it that was surrounded by a clay berm, which seems to be a feature of early Caddo shaft tomb burials. And so here's a profile showing the berm, and then actually they started the tomb by digging out some Pleistocene clay from somewhere along the Sabine River to get that grayish blue clay. And then they covered it, put the burial down on the floor, which is this, and then built up the berm. And what we have are 3 sets of teeth enamel. That was all that's preserved in this thing. And you can also see most of the grave goods, which include vessels and several hundred arrow points and clusters and celts and other things, were not associated with a particular individual, but were piled on the north side of the pit. Don't know why that is. Some of these point clusters, though, I'm pretty sure are associated with these individuals. And these would usually be 40 or 50 arrow points of the same raw material arranged as if they were in a quiver.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A smaller but still important early Caddo mound center is the Hale Site in the Big Cypress drainage, where 2 platform mounds, and then 3 smaller mounds that covered burned structures. Actually, make that 4 mounds. And then habitation around it with a plaza unmarked, but here approximately, and a borrow pit. Britt Bousman gave me this. This is a recent LiDAR image of the site, and you can still see it, even though it's partly forested. But here's the first rectangular mound. Here's the second one. There's the borrow pit. That's pretty amazing. And someone needs to do a systematic LiDAR survey of East Texas to look for other features that have not been found. The Mound Pond site is also on Big Cypress Creek, part of a multi-mound complex. One mound is about 300 meters away from this one. This was excavated by Clarence Webb and some of his colleagues and Glenn Good before the mound was bulldozed by some subdivision or something. But you can see here the darker area at the bottom, that's below the mound. That's a sub-mound midden that's full of pottery sherds that date from about 1030 to 1220. And then these are then they built the first mound stage probably very quickly. You can see a darker stain here. That's a burned, remnants of a burned house there. Then they dumped another mound fill, and then another house was almost at the top. Pretty typical kinds of things where a lot of these are just, they're not, they're building mounds because they want to burn and bury structures. And in some cases, a site like the T.N. Coles Mound in the Sulphur River drainage, the mound was built just simply to hold a big shaft tomb. And that shaft tomb went down about 3.6 meters. There were 4 or 5 individuals buried in it. All of them had cranially modeled skulls, where the Caddo had shaped the skulls in a particular way. And a large number of grave goods, like the other shaft tombs that we've seen. I just couldn't resist including this one from the site, since that's such a spectacular Caddo vessel. And you can see here the red area where they rubbed a red pigment in the lines in some places. And initially, when this was excavated and identified in the 1950s, this was called Holly Fine Engraved. But after working on Holly for many years by many different people, it's now recognized that Holly Fine Engraved may have similar spirals and things, but never has these punctated areas, and spiral engraved does. So that was kind of the kicker. Take a look at Texas Beyond History if you want to read more about that. Another platform mound and a substructural mound is at the A.C. Mackin site up in the along a tributary of the Red River. This was actually excavated in part by the Texas Historical Commission back in the 1970s before they were built Big Pine Lake. And so this is one of the few that actually had pretty substantial work done. It's cutting off the end, but Mound A had several platforms in it. Over here off the screen is Mound B, and it was over a structure. And
I can see Mound B on my screen.
yeah, I'm blocked by all the people.
Oh, you need to do what Phil was doing. Go up to your right-hand corner and click that view button and change the view so you can see stuff.
And have a view on the right hand
Oh,
corner.
well.
Yeah, it's probably because it's full screen, but let me see. Okay, click view, I think. It's gonna do
Hey,
anything.
Tim,
Yeah,
Tim, you should be able to just take your mouse and hover over the bar and click on it and just drag it out.
which bar?
The Zoom
with
bar,
the photos.
not the PowerPoint.
I don't have any bar over anything.
When I mean the pictures. Can you move the mouse over and click on it and just drag it off the screen?
I don't want to have to do that for every one.
No, it
Go ahead.
should be.
Go back to
It'll
full
say
screen
where
on
you
your
put it.
PowerPoint though, Tim.
Okay.
It was the Zoom view that needed to change. Is there a view options at the top for you?
Now when it's full screen.
Okay.
Let's try something else. No.
It's a Zoom thing. It's not a PowerPoint thing.
Yeah, let me yeah, just we're two mounds here. Larger platform mound joined to the mysteriously vanished house mound. And like all platform mounds, it had several surfaces in it and kind of date from AD 967 to 1162. So early Caddo. Now I can move on to the middle Caddo period from basically AD 1250 to 1440. You can see that there are important mounds on all drainages except for the sulfur, which kind of continues. The sulfur had plenty of Caddo people living there, but they weren't all that active in building mounds here. Down here in Arkansas, they were. The biggest Caddo mound ever built is at the confluence of the Sulphur and the Red River, the Battle Mound. Okay. Pace McDonald is a fairly extensive habitation site and mound center with borrow pits and other things, platform mound as in Mound 1, others more likely to be house mounds or substructural mounds of one kind or another. This part of this site is owned by the Texas Historical Commission, I believe, but the local landowner maintains it. Okay, we did get permission to do some work in the area, and basically we could see these small areas that we're pretty well convinced are house mounds. Here's the main platform mound. Here was another one over here with a number of habitation areas, but nothing that says that there's a plaza here. This site dated 1290 to 1404 AD. Another site that Waldo knows something about, this is up on Caddo Creek, a few miles from its confluence with the Neches River. And this site was found by the landowner, but he reported it to UT in 1935, I believe. And that's A.T. Jackson standing in the hole he dug. at that time, and it was lost. Waldo found it again, kind of, and we went out and got permission from the landowners, thank goodness, and they let us work out there. First thing we did is remote sensing of the mound in an area around it. And so this is kind of shows our interpretation of the extent of the mound as it exists now. And you'll see there are structures within the mound. Here's the first, they're on lobes of the mound. So there's one, the northern end with a hearth in it, and one at the southern end. And you can see these blackened areas through here, here, and here. Those are 1935 UT trenches. So we were able to relocate those. And this is just the interpretation, but two houses apparently in the mound. So we did a couple of units to investigate, and in unit 2, about 30, 40 centimeters down, we found a darkened area with lots of ash and charcoal and lots of daub and burned dauber nests. So we know that there was a burned Caddo structure here in the mound, and then there was one at the base of the mound. But I think the remote sensing shows those rather well. And this site pretty much dates to the mid 14th century. One of the most important sites and mound centers in the Natchez Angelina is the Washington Square Mound site, which is in the city of Nacogdoches. It's actually in part on school property as well as private property, but it sits on a nice interfluve between two creeks that run south into a bigger stream. A fanciful drawing, perhaps, of one of the mounds at the site in the late 19th century. 4 mounds here, 1 and 2, because it looks like it was 2 mounds that conjoined, and they had structures in them. This one as well. The one that you can't see, mound 4, is a burial mound, and it happens to be in the front yard of a person's property. And Jim Corbin got permission to do some testing in the mound, and he found a number of tombs, some with multiple individuals like this, others individual, excavated a few, but mainly left them there. So the mound is still there on the property. The landowners, are protecting it. It's probably a state archaeological landmark anyway, and nobody has really done any work on this mound since 1980. There was later work by the Texas Archeological Society, kind of a little bit here, but mainly out here in this area. And there wasn't a whole lot. There was some habitation debris, but not a lot. So there may be a small plaza in part of that place. Probably the most important middle Caddo mound on the Sabine, and maybe in all of East Texas, is called the Jamestown site. It's on a tributary of the Sabine River. It has 7 mounds around what we think are 2 plazas, and then midden areas and habitation areas and things like that. We did remote sensing over here, and it may be hard to see, but on this there's let's see, a C and a B and a D somewhere out there. But what we think, we're picking up the outline of plazas, and then we're picking up the outlines of probably burned houses, or in a case of C, probably a mound. After we did this work, which was in 2008, this property is owned by the Archeological Conservancy, and I approached them with asking permission for a small group of folks to return to the site, since we had done all this with their permission, and investigate some of these house-like anomalies with minimally invasive shovel testing. And they turned me down. They thought it was more important to let people dig in the Southwest to dig up all the sites than to do a little bit of work here. And I never could get an answer as to why, other than they said, we're going to need an NSF style grant proposal from you to dig even 10 shovel tests on the site. And so there hasn't been any more work at the site since. We did, or I didn't, but a East Texas Archeological Society member from the 1950s, the uncle, well, let's see, he was the father of Mark Walters, and I think his uncle Sam Whiteside dug in Mound A at Jamestown and documented 2 levels of burned houses. And this one must have been in a berm, given the shape of the subsoil below it. Let's see, and Jamestown dates between 1310 and 1443. And you'll notice, and I'll get back to it later, that all these Middle Caddo mounds pretty much end at the end of the Middle Caddo period. They didn't keep building these. They started a whole new series. This is a really interesting one because it's a completely exposed Caddo village in a lignite mine, and you can see the plan of the structures, and they have different shapes, and some have these extended entrance ways and things like that. But from the very beginning of laying out this village, you know, this was an open kind of plaza area. I'm surprised it didn't have a marker pole in it, but so they built around this thing for about on and off for 300 years. Let's see. And this was kind of the main component. And at the very top, the northern end, this was the circular mound with a structure underneath it. This site is called Oak Hill Village, and it has many radiocarbon dates, but Zach determined that most of them fall in 2 groups from 1219 to 1268 and 1299 to 1349. But after all this, it continued to be occupied until 1450. Keith Mound, a single, very large platform mound with habitation areas scattered around over a good sized area. I think this mound was at least 15 feet in height. In 1935, a UT archaeologist named Walter Goldschmidt dug a big trench right through it. And there were all kinds of features in the floor and in the profile. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, he never bothered to fill in that trench. And fortunately, Ken Brown, a local resident of Titus County, but also eventually a PhD from UTSA, I believe, works at Tarl. He was able to make this profile before, you know, and you can see it's scattered series of stratified burned houses marked by ash, also separated in some cases with midden deposits that articulate with the burned areas of the houses. This particular trench is still open. The Archeological Conservancy owns this site as well, and they've refused permission for us to go back and clean this profile again and take a modern set of samples, like 10 or 15 radiocarbon dates. The Keith Mound has a couple of dates, and it's pretty much dating from after 1383 to 1445. The Sanders site in Lamar County is a famous site, very early excavated by UT in 1931. It has two mounds. You can still see them. They're not very prominent. Here and here, in between the two of them, is a thick midden deposit. And so when UT went out there in 1931, they sort of ho-hum did a trench here and discovered there were 4 levels of burned structures that had clay floors. But they were more interested in the East Mound because, I'll back for it, because of the number of burials that they discovered on there, many that had multiple individuals in them, others individual, but these had a very diverse arrangement of pottery vessels, marine shell, conch shell, copper, celts, arrow points, anything that you could name came out of this. And some of the artifacts seem to suggest relationship between it and the Spiro site, based on some of the decorated shell gorges and things like that. But let's see. Okay, so here's the West Mound that had temple platforms. Here's the East Mound with the burials, and then this was the midden area was here. There's a large plaza out here, and then they had all these village areas, and we've, I think, defined even more since then. But that this area is about 200 acres at least, and the site certainly deserved. We then did remote sensing over here, and we're able to link up most of these areas that we defined on the basis of surface collecting and shovel testing with Caddo house clusters. And so we have that here. We have not done any work down here yet. I'm sure all of you have heard of the Keystone Pipeline. That was, that came through Texas. Well, it came through right here. Initially, the plan was to come right through the center of the site. And I worked with the landowner to bug the Corps, we worked with the Caddo. We did everything we could to get them to move the line, and they actually did. And they moved it up to here and said there's no archaeology there because the previous survey by an unnamed firm out of Austin said there was nothing there. So the landowner asked us to check, and it turned out that there was. And so then this firm out of Austin got back and got paid to test the site, test that part of the site. There wasn't much there, but I mean, it was a Caddo area that, needed to be defined for whatever reason. Let's see. Okay. I always think of this site when I think of Dan Prickle, because he was in charge of the TAS excavations here in 1991 and 1992 during the field school. And he basically spent most of his time in this habitation area that had evidence of rectangular structures that weren't on mounds, but the site did have 3 mounds, the very large platform mound, another structural mound, and this they had said many, many years ago when it was plowed, they plowed out a lot of burials. Let's see. This site dates right up to about or starts about 1250 AD. So it's very early in the Middle Caddo period.
Get in here.
Okay. This was the mound that Dan was able to do some excavation in. And you can see it's, again, typical of Caddo. Here you have a natural A horizon. They built first episode of mound construction here, and then built and burned a house on top of it. Then here came the second construction episode. And then this is the remnant of the burned house on the third episode. But based on the dates, this whole thing was built, in a generation probably, or no more than two. On to the late Caddo, post AD 1440. And just keep the AD 1440 in your mind when I get to the very end. The Caddo cultures that were still building mounds at that time include the McCurtain, Texarkana, Belcher, Titus, and Frankston. They probably did over here, but these are not as well known. So I'm going to talk about these four since they're mainly in Texas. This is a classic late Caddo mound called the Sam Kaufman site along the Red River. It's been seriously eroded by the river. It had two mounds at one time. The west mound was several hundred meters to the west, and it had a series of stratified burned houses in it. This area here at the east was investigated by the Texas Archeological Society during the 1991 and 92 field school. And most of the work was done in sort of habitation areas around the mound, which is here, and then in the mound itself. Yeah, kind of a close-up where you can see various mounds with radiocarbon dates that we obtained with pit features and things like that, along with an outline of a rectangular structure with a clay floor, and dug into that rectangular structure was a large shaft tomb. And you can see most of it, but I believe there were 9 individuals buried in here, accompanied by a wide range of exotic artifacts, as well as these pottery vessels, crushed and broken, but placed mainly along the edge. The premier individual was here in the center, and marked by a lot of shell beads, marine shell beads. And it's kind of hard to see, but it looks like, and he was a senior adult, and it looks like a woman was partly laid over him. And I think that was her head. And then these others are probably young adult males who were likely sacrificed when this tomb was built to take this fellow. The Hale site is the site that I mentioned at the very beginning, where the Spanish entrada in 1691 came to visit this site. And when they made a little map showing the mound with a templo on it, this is the mound. In 1939 and 1940, UT had federal money from the WPA, and they excavated a large portion of the mound. And this is kind of the large platform mound with village areas scattered all around and burial plots and things like that. This was likely the channel of the river at the time the site was being occupied. These village areas, we found those a number of years ago with the permission of the landowner, who subsequently deeded the property to the Caddo Nation. And so the Caddo Nation actually control, I think, a sizable chunk of this section anyway, and all the mound. Part of the mound is left, but not all of it. This happened to be the one structure that was found underneath the mound. And why, the internal partition is a unique feature of Caddo sites in this area. But what's even more unique about it, based on the ceramic artifacts that have been found at this level, this particular house was built in approximately AD 1250. But it was not until about 250 years later that the Caddo came along. Well, I mean, this is the Caddo house, sorry. Another group of Caddo came along and they built the platform mound right on top of this guy. So the Caddo groups that were living in this area remembered where this structure was. They must have marked it with poles that stuck up, but it's no coincidence that it literally, they started building the mound right here. And this is a great WPA drawing that colorized, but okay, that structure I just showed you is in K, which is below the mound, and it was a village area. This was all midden and trash and so on. And then there was, a house here that probably was, had a berm on it. And then I and J were built in the blink of an eye within 20 years, starting at 1500 AD, again, based on the pottery found in it. And then at one end of the mound, this primary platform down here, they built a whole series of structures on different mound zones from A to H. And from the ceramics from that area, it looks like these 8 things were probably built 15 to 20 year intervals over 140 years, and stopped close to 1690. And I'll talk about that in a minute. That's the most recent, mound level that had any structures. So if this is indeed the mound drawn by the Spanish, then there should be structures on that zone that would correlate with the Templo shown on the drawing. So, this was this was kind of the principal earlier occupation, where you could see series of circular structures, entranceways. Here again, it's kind of a screen, all double walled things. So these are all restricted access, special purpose structures of one kind and another. Feature 23 was a bald eagle burial. Pretty unique in the Caddo area. I think there's one other one known. Let's see. Okay, this is the zone that would correlate with the top zone in the mound, and we do have, that's a structure there, with burned down deposits, and there's probably at least one in here. But that is a little dubious, perhaps. And my opinion is that the mound and Templo that the Spanish drew was basically already abandoned and was sinking into the mound, because it looks like it's half buried in the mound as it is. Okay, this whole area here was an upper Nasoni Caddo community that ran from here all the way over to here. All these sites are mound sites. This is a French trading post built by Henri Joutel in 1719 at the site of one of the main villages. The site was subsequently bulldozed away by a company from Belgium that wanted to turn the property into a soybean farm, which they did. Horace Cave still exists. It's owned by the Archeological Conservancy. Ely Moors and Hargrove Moors are still there, but don't really look like much. And every collector and pot hunter knows about them. This was one of the large cemeteries that went with this whole community. And there was another one right over here that a landowner told us about. So this was one center of Caddo land that eventually became called the Caddo Hadacho, linked in with them, otherwise known as the True Caddo. Ely Moors had two kind of house mounds with some borrow pits and a midden. UT came along in 1932 and did a little bit here to show that there was a burned structure in it, but mainly worked in Mound 1. And this is what they ended up doing. There were a number of burials in here, but there was probably a house. They just didn't see it, but you could see all kinds of different objects and things, including a really incredible deposit of charred pecan shells, matting, basketry, and 200 plus charred beans, cultivated beans. And Leslie has looked at all that. A unique deposit for sure. I wish I'd put a picture of it in there, but anyway, but you can see, there's cemeteries out here. The whole area is just one habitation and cemetery area after another. And it's the knowledge we have about these sites is really pitiful. It's all based on what A.T. Jackson did in 1932 and maybe 10 pages of crude notes to go on. This is the Horace Cave Mound Center, which is kind of at the eastern end of the Nasoni community, and you have a linear series of mounds. They kind of overlap and conjoin with each other, suggesting they are house mounds. And then there's one mound way off in this direction. It has a deliberately constructed plaza. This is a raised clay ridge here. And then it has these linear clay ridges that were constructed. There's habitation debris under them. No one's quite sure what these are. There have been a few sites that have it. This could be, astronomically aligned. I don't know about this. Some have suggested they're dividers between compounds or things like that, but the only information that we even have on them is from pot hunters who were interviewed while they were looting the site. So we didn't really get a whole lot of them. Moving into the Big Cypress Creek area, one of the major mound sites is called the Shelby Mound on a tributary of Greasy Creek. And it gets its name Greasy Creek because you wouldn't believe how many Caddo midden sites are along there. And that's, the pot hunters love that. That's how they describe these things, greasy middens and stuff. But so you had a mound at one end, habitations at another, with a large community cemetery at the other end. And the Shelby Mound itself had, let's see here, well, didn't get that, but it has at least two structures built in it, one at original ground level and then another one. The cemetery is unique. This is the drawing that was actually done by one of the collectors. But what they discovered, and some of this material has been documented by professional archaeologists, but one of the burials in the cemetery here was placed on a cedar litter, a cedar pole litter, which is very uncommon other than at Spiro. And one of the cedar poles, it was marking the burial, and it stuck up and stuck up on through the ground, and the pot hunter dug it up, and somehow or another he was convinced to turn it over to UT, which he did, and we were able to get a radiocarbon date on that pole, which suggests it was emplaced about 1480 to 1530 or so, right before DeSoto. This was an area of a lot of mound sites, small mound sites, not platform mounds, but house mounds that have structures underneath them. And you can see the pattern, the circular pattern, extended entranceway. I'd be interested to hear what Elliot thinks about that alignment there, as opposed to this one here. They were clearly rebuilt. You can tell that here's the center post, and you've got three, and you really only needed one at a time. This one had two, and you've got two lines of posts. So there's a cluster of about 6 or 7 mounds all together in this one area. And they're all pretty much like this, dating, well, anywhere from 1450 to 1650. We have a number of dates, but they were done too long ago to get really good dates. So we need to redate these. Another example of one of these things where this house here, or structure, the entranceway, was built at the modern ground level in a pit, had a clay floor, and then the mound was built over it. But you can see, when looking at the ceramics from this site, this structure and this structure go together, and this and that go together, and they're not contemporary. I mean, it's interesting that this one faces right to that. And their first one is like 1450 to 1515. And then about 30 years later, they came back, and built these two. Here, I'm willing to guess those are marker poles that are in a plaza area. So that, this was marking these mounds or monuments to the Caddo people who were living there at the time. These were not very prominent, but were assuredly well known by the community. Pine Tree Mound is, again, another late Caddo site, but a little different in that it has 3 mounds in a plaza, but at this time, plazas are not very common, particularly one that's rather large. It has a community cemetery at one end. This had structures in it of different colored floors and things like that. These had structures in them as well. And this site was occupied for a pretty good length of time. And the calibrations that Zach Selden did suggest first occupied about 1400 to 1430. And that looks like it was this mound. And then other dates, most of the dates are from 1450 to 1495, and there's quite a number of them. But you can see around the plaza. I mean, this was all sacred space, but you've got, structures here along the edge, and their function, who knows, at this moment. Here's kind of give you an example of all the different radiocarbon dates, either in the area of the mounds, certainly going up to here, up to 1600, and then the village area going, I'm not real comfortable with agreeing that it goes to 1650, but that's probably my problem. So this sacred area was surrounded by farmsteads and hamlets for various compounds and residential areas around them. If you take a wider view, and I don't have a slide for that, this community probably covers 40 kilometers north, south, and east, west of farmsteads. And luckily, the only way we even know about these is because this was all in a lignite mine, and they could not avoid this area. I believe the Archeological Conservancy now owns the sacred part. This mound was built atop a house. I don't know if they're planning on getting rid of it or not, but okay. The Morris Mound that Tom Middlebrook knows about, down on the Sabine, and it had a single mound. I think it had two mounds, but this mound turned out again to have a structure under the mound, and at some point this Caddo community excavated a shaft, this circular shaft tomb through it, like we've seen at some of the other sites. And this is what it looked like when they cleaned it up. And it really appears that there was a wood coffin for the Caddo individual who was buried here. And you can see almost all the grave goods are put on the north side of the grave, at some distance from him, except for this very large biface that he was probably holding in his right hand. This site dates late 15th century to probably about 1530 AD, again, right at the time when DeSoto came through. Last mound that I want to talk about is the A.C. Saunders site on the Neches River. It had two mounds. One, northern one, is called an ash temple or an ash mound. The entire thing is composed of about 1.5 meters of ash and little else. This mound down here was built entirely of midden and trash, and it was built on top of a really big house. And so the idea seems to be this is an area of feasting residue for the community. A lot of the firing and so on ended up here as part of whatever kind of practices the Caddo were doing at the time with ash. Feature 2 mound is gone. Feature 1 is still visible. The Archeological Conservancy, again, owns the western half of the mound. The private landowner, Mr. Saunders, owns this part. This was a structure that was under the midden mound. It's about 15 meters in diameter, which is rather large. You can tell it wasn't your everyday structure because you certainly wouldn't be constructing a clay hearth to block your entrances. So there was another big pit feature here. See, this was a restricted structure of some kind. And then, as soon as they burned it down, then they launched into about 50 years of feasting activity, building up a massive deposit of animal bones and mussel shells and pottery sherds and pipes and so on. That site, which is this AN19 here, is at the center of this Upper Neches Caddo community. All these red triangles are basically known Caddo cemeteries of one kind or another. Some have habitation debris, some don't, but they didn't get, almost all of these were excavated long ago, back in the 30s. AN201 wasn't. I mean, there were excavations there, but the main excavations took place in, I believe, 2016 by TxDOT. They also had excavated AN38 quite a number of years before that, where it had habitation debris and small cemeteries. Some of these were exposed along the shoreline at Lake Palestine in the 60s and 70s. But a robust population at that time, which is anywhere from 1450 to 1680. One last thing to just kind of drive home the idea of these multiple mound centers as the center of these communities as persistent and prominent places on the landscape, that the Caddo constructed in very specific ways. And the way I tried to do this here is, we know in 1542 and 1543, a DeSoto, Moscoso, and Trotta came through from the Mississippi River through Arkansas, and then came into the Caddo area here down in East Texas. And they were looking for, well-populated provinces where they could get corn. And so this was their trek. And you could see in most cases, they're hitting the provinces, and they had guides who tried to mislead them, but it's hard to do because all the guides were being killed by the Spanish. But they were following trails to get to the major mound centers of the Caddo that still existed at that time. And the only problem was that the Caddo did not realize that the Caddo did not keep their corn at the major mound centers, unlike Mississippian groups to the east. Here, it was brought to the caddy, and he redistributed, and the Spanish never figured that out. But they would just describe, this is the poorest land in the world. I mean, it's dry, there's no corn anywhere, and blah, 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 and so they continued on down. This place called Nondaco is the pine tree mound that we just talked about. The Nacogdoches, that's Nacogdoches, present day Nacogdoches. Guasco is where the George C. Davis site is, but the Mound Center was not occupied at that time. And so I'm wondering if this might not have to be adjusted a ways, because they do mention there was a thriving Caddo community up here. And I think that's the Caddo community where the A.C. Saunders Mound site is. But they had problems because you can see a lot of the Caddo names start with N.A. And that's how they named their places. N.A. means place of, like Nadaco, what is that? Pecan shells, maybe. Something like that. But anyway, and so Lacani might have been misheard or miswritten by the Spanish, and I don't think it's necessarily there, but this is all pretty speculative, and anybody you ask is going to tell you something different. Okay, well, the last little bit that I want to mention is, as I said at the beginning, there is great periodicity in terms of when Caddo mounds and monuments are being built and when they're being abandoned. And in particular, the middle Caddo sites, every one that I have radiocarbon dates on shows that they were abandoned by approximately AD 1440. When I look at the late Caddo mounds and the radiocarbon dates, I'm seeing that they dating after 1450 to 1690s. And 1450 is a huge hinge point in the paleoenvironments of North America because of massive droughts. And here is the worst drought that ever occurred in East Texas. It just happens to date from 1444 to 1460, right at that period when you have one set of practices and mounds being discontinued and a whole new set of mounds being started. And I'll give you an idea of you can see the extent of this drought in 1450. It was worse in the Southwest, but it covered almost all of Texas, certainly all of the Caddo area and so on. And so it has been identified, as a serious drought. The areas in blue are areas where it was much wetter. And so you just have this periodicity, but I think that this break here between middle and Caddo is just what it's representing is not a collapse of Caddo society like happened at Spiro, but a renewal of a new Caddo society but still continued to construct mounds for the same purposes all the way along. Just slight variations in size and number and placement, but otherwise the Caddo were one of the groups that, they were continuously occupied the area from 8900 and going back earlier. The European epidemics that maybe DeSoto brought in this area really had no effect on the Caddo. We don't see any population drop or anything like that, until we get up here to 1690, and that's when I think the Caddo stopped building mounds. And that's it.
It's very nice. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
A comment, Tim, about the Keith Mound.
Yeah, I know you know about that one.
Oh yeah, TC11. Anyway, about 1970, I think it was, the landowner bulldozed it. He got tired of people crossing over and digging holes in it, and just to stop it, he just bulldozed it.
Yeah, I've seen a map that shows where he bulldozed.
Yeah,
And it's
well,
kind of north of the big mound.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
But the area where the trench was and everything, the trench is filled in now, of course, with that. Anyway, we didn't do any digging other than just to expose a profile and record that as best we could.
Profile in the mound, you mean?
Yeah, in the mound.
Yeah.
But anyway, I took a bunch of pictures and all of that. I think we about Ken Brown and me and a guy named Tommy Johns who lives down in Upshur.
I know Tommy. Well, Britt Bousman told me that he and a few guys from SMU were over there.
Yeah.
Not maybe the next year, and they did a little poking around, but not nothing that was ever put into notes or artifacts recovered per se. I mean, there are artifacts from Keith, but most of those come from Goldschmidt's work from 1935.
Well, there was another. There was a burial site. Gosh, I guess I'm direction-wise here, but probably 50 meters from the site on different property. I was back toward Highway 49, and a guy potted, I think it was about 20 burials in there. I was with him one day walking down a road over there, and we found a bear-tooth pendant. Really very unique artifact and in perfect condition, and just laying in the rut of a sandy road. Anyway, he went back and he potted it.
Do you remember the name of that or number or anything?
No, I don't think it was ever recorded. I didn't find out about it until much later. I think after I'd already moved to Austin.
Yeah.
But we found out about the bulldozed mound just about the time the TAS Field School was having its first Kerrville dig, and so that was that place is at about 1970, I think. If anybody ever went in and for another excavation, would find a pretty interesting structure beneath that mound.
Well, he had one in the, in his trench, which was pretty wide. So he had a portion of a post hole outline at the very bottom, and then he had a couple more as he went up in the mound. Yeah.
The mound almost appeared to be made out of mid materials, and you could see the basket loads of dirt, and ash and pottery and chert and bones and just junk. Basket load after basket load.
I think of what we could do if we were in a position to get 10 or 15 radiocarbon dates from that stratified mound profile.
Yeah,
what we would learn. But and I'm sure there's other mounds out there that have yet to be found or reported or whatever.
Yeah. Well, there's plans to build a lake on Sulphur River and White Oak Creek, and that would really have a lot of stuff there. But on the south side of Sulphur River, looking at some maps and some old 3D photographs, there are several formations in there that don't look natural. They're close to the river, and they're very conical, and they're pretty tall, and it'd be hard to get access to get in there and do anything. But it's pretty interesting. I'd like to find out what's there before they decide to build the lake.
Yeah, and
very controversial.
I'm not sure who is involved in the CRM work or if it's even started. It may be the same firm that's doing Bodark, Lower Bodark, as well as there's one called Ralph Hall on the Sulphur that's kind of, it's upstream from Wright-Patman.
Yes.
But it's not really in good Caddo country where it is. But the Corps of Engineers is going to be raising Wright-Patman 8 feet this year.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. And the work is already going to be underway probably next month, but it's going to they're going to have to deal with a lot of recorded Caddo sites that probably have mounds, villages.
Oh, yes.
Burial, the whole 9 yards. And that's going to be a multi-year project to deal with that.
Well, I'm out of that country. I doubt if I ever get back up there, but it's undergoing a lot of changes now.
Yeah.
Tim?
A lot of people up there are very much opposed to the lake on Titus County.
Yeah. Yes, Phil.
Great presentation. You've expanded greatly my want to know about. Okay. But two things. The Tehran map. Has that ever been anyone attempted to overlay it on modern maps?
Yes, we have. And in fact, we've succeeded in part because, let's see here. If I can.
I'd like to get that from you if I can. I'm a big map guy, and it's I'm on landscape. The other is I saw a lot of round post patterns that I've poured over the Caddo Mound, George C. Davis site. And
I don't know if
Carolyn Spock's a great report. Carolyn, are you there yet?
she was here, but
yeah, I saw her earlier. and I've spent my lifetime pretty much looking, building houses and studying the post hole patterns. I think I've asked you before on some of this. So,
Well, that's why I asked you, if you go to where the mound is, at the northern end of the mound, some kind of structure. I mean, is it it's not a house.
oh yeah, I see
What is it?
what you're asking. It does the different sites that have round post holes. Is there dimensions, diameters?
Yeah, I
Post
have
hole.
the
I like to
I
get
have
all
the-
that. I'd like to study all these together now.
I have the plans and the dimensions for I think there's 18 structures in the mound. And then there's a couple that would be out here in this area, just non-mound sites. We actually,
Are you talking about the other various sites in addition to George C.
what
Is that
now?
what you told me?
Huh?
I want to see all of the different sites you talked about tonight where they have round post hole patterns.
Most all of them do.
Oh, and get the dimensions and then to kind of do an overall comprehensive look at all of them.
Well, I can
And-
show you where to get the information, but I'm not gonna, that's a lot of information you're asking for to round up diameters on probably 150 houses, but I know
Yeah. Okay.
there's a PhD that a guy did in 2010 at UT on Caddo architecture,
Uh-huh.
and he rounded up everything that he could on every structure, not just in Texas, but anywhere.
Well, gosh. Yeah.
know,
I need to talk to
And
them.
I think all that kind of data is there. How many plan maps he produced, showing post hole patterns and things like that, I'm not sure about. But
Okay. Well,
there-
I'll
we can, it's not
Okay.
a huge effort to round this up. But you had asked, have we placed any of this on a topo? And yes, this is placed on a topo. The mound, the Caddo Nation owns that property.
talking about Hatchell.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
they own from the mound through this area here, that area in there. But we did remote sensing and some excavations for a proposed project that never got built, but we were able to link up these 4 areas with a known site on the topo,
I said, well, great.
where we had geophysical anomalies that were in the right place and had patterns, partial patterns of houses to feel pretty confident about that. And we think this is the Cabe mound. So, and we know where that is on the topo.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Hey, that's I'll talk to you about that by email. Okay.
yeah. I mean, this could be someone's lifetime work to investigate all these little areas and see what is still there. I mean, still mainly, farmland.
Uh-huh.
That's, we got permission to work out there because it's just a pasture. I don't think they plow it up much anymore. But it can be difficult getting private landowner permission.
Yeah. Well, all right. Great presentation, Tim.
All right. Thanks, Phil.
Yes, indeed. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Perttula. I know that this was quite an endeavor on your part, putting together all these slides.
Well, perfect timing, because there will be a monograph on all this that will be published later this year. So
oh, excellent.
it made it a lot easier to select slides anyway.
Okay, well, once again, we do appreciate it very much. Very informative. And I guess we're ready to call it an evening, everybody. So we'll look for you next month on the 20th. And in the meantime, stay safe and come back and see us. Oh, and we're so happy. There were a lot of folks came in tonight to hear this talk, folks that we haven't seen before on our Zoom presentation. And so if you were
Do you know how many participants you had?
I think we had 36, 37, something like that
Okay.
at the most. But of course, I'm no telling how many people are going to be watching it on the YouTube.
Yeah.
So I don't know if we can. I think you can get a count on that too, can we? By the views, by the number of views.
Yeah, I think you can get that.
Indeed.
Great.
All right. Well, everybody, then we'll say good night.
Okay, good night.
Night,
Thanks,
everybody.
Mike.
Thank you. It was great, Tim.
Thanks.
Night, thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Night.